So we're going to cover 3 broad topics. And the topics that we're going to be covering are the marketing landscape in technology. We're also going to be talking about the challenges in acquiring talent and what that means for us in business. And then we're also going to talk about innovations in technology and what that means for the future of work, and especially in the education setting as well. And then if we have some time, if there are questions that we don't get to towards the end, please feel free to ask us questions, and we'd be happy to field those as well. So let's get started. So one of the things that we have all been in this marketing landscape is how have the behaviors changed in marketing, and how have the needs changed? How has the broader digital environment made what we are doing more challenging or more interesting or more fun? And so this is a broad topic, and I'd like to put it to our panel here and find out some thoughts. One of the questions that we have landed on is does technology and digital change the fundamentals of marketing? And if so, how? Or do they stay the same? So Kurt, I'm going to start with you, if that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, having practiced marketing now for about 20 years in my career, I think one of the things that's somewhat heartening is the fact that the fundamentals don't actually change, right? So the idea of knowing who your target audience is, knowing what are the key messages you need to deliver to that audience. I think what has changed is the tools that we have available to us as marketers in order to reach those people. And certainly one of the big trends that we all face, I think, is more data than we can deal with oftentimes, and also the fragmentation of our audiences. So it used to be that we could segment an audience and find kind of their media consumption patterns very easily and reach at scale these segments. And I think with today's consumers, we find that people are consuming media in a very nonlinear way. They're going to multiple sources for entertainment, for other forms of content. And so as a result, the ability for us to create kind of cohesive campaigns that follow people over time becomes both more difficult and more easy at the same time.
Great. Heather?
I'll chime in then. Hi, I'm Heather Zynczak. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Pluralsight, which is an enterprise learning platform. So on that note, I loved the name of this session, the Madmen. How many people in the room watch Madmen? Or have watched Madmen? Okay, I love that show, and yes, I do love it because Don Draper is dreamy. But also, and my husband does look a little like him, at least in my opinion. But I also love it because it's a really great example of how marketing has changed. So while the fundamentals that you're still trying to have connections with your customers, while the fundamental theory you're trying to do with marketing has stayed the same, how we do it has so drastically changed. I started out as an engineer, and I have an accounting and finance undergrad and master's. I'm an extremely analytical, numbers-oriented person. And I only moved into marketing later in my career because of how marketing has changed. I wouldn't have been a good marketer in the Mad Men days. Like, I wouldn't have been a creative who came up with a great idea and then had martini lunches and then won an award 9 months later. Like, that wouldn't have worked for me. Like, I'm too rational, I have to see the data. Everything today can and should be measured. You have more creative freedom to try different things because you can test everything. You can be held accountable to everything. You should be your CFO's favorite person at the company because you're so buttoned up with your marketing data. So I actually believe the landscape or how we're going to market as marketers has drastically changed. And it's one of the reasons myself, an engineer and an analytics and a data geek at heart, loves being a CMO.
So Leela, I know you have a thought about this.
I do. So I'm Leela. I'm the CMO at Lever. We're a recruiting software platform. We were told to try and be contrarian. I'm not sure if that's going to be fully possible because we're quite aligned. But just to tie together what Kurt was saying with Heather, so actually, I think the fundamentals have become more important because there's just so much noise and there's so much competition for the attention of our customers. And if I think back to Mad Men, I actually think marketers would be more successful if they went back to the idea of an SMP, of a single-minded proposition. So you think back to the campaigns that Don Draper and co were dreaming up in their offices, right? I mean, you can argue, yes, the channels, the landscape, the ability to measure, all of those things have changed, but there's such pure simplicity and focus in this idea of an SMP that I think has actually kind of gone by the wayside in a lot of today's marketing. It's almost as if we've become as ADD sort of like because of this massive communication channels as sometimes our customers have.
So one of the problems with this is, of course, with all this media fragmentation that we're talking about and accountability, we've got this content explosion that's happened as well. Harsha, tell us about that. Where has this become more complex for us as marketers and organizations?
I mean, I think if you think about the modern marketer, they're pulled in several different directions all at once, right? Sort of, you have to figure out your technology stack. You have to figure out how you operate in this sort of omni-channel environment. You have this explosion of data, like we talked about, and your consumer expects you to be everywhere, right? Your consumer expects you, while they're watching that YouTube video, to be right there so they can click and find out more about sort of whatever product it is they're dreaming at that point. And the stresses of that sort of push and pull marketers in various directions. And I think one of the things that's a casualty out of those stresses is actually good content, good creative, good storytelling, all of that kind of stuff. And technology has basically kind of made marketing dumber. You can deploy lots of marketing very easily without having thought through what you're actually saying and how you relate to your end consumer. And the content explosion, to me, largely actually signifies that, the sort of dumbing down of the message. And I think that's one that all marketers should be aware of, so you're not falling into that trap of, I can put a million things out there that basically say nothing, and end goal, you're not really standing for anything in the marketplace.
I remember, as a digital marketer, I started my career in digital marketing, almost 20 years ago, and the ability to test so many messages against so many different audiences. And what I realized was that what you said, Leela, this notion that just a singular value proposition really gets diffused in this. And Harsha, when you talk about this explosion of content and all of the different places, I think about my 4 children. My 10-year-old, he's gaming, and he's got his tablet underneath the terminal, and he's got another device. He's got 3 devices at the same time. And I'm thinking, damn that marketer who's trying to market to him, because that is an attribution nightmare. And I don't know how they do it. And so just this notion of the fundamentals do stay the same, but the challenges associated with this content explosion, is really, really tricky.
Well, I think it's getting that single proposition that you talked about, but you have to, today people expect it to be personalized, because we can personalize with data almost all messages in the marketplace. And so how do you still get your single proposition that's personalized for each person across many different channels? I always joke that your competition isn't who you think it is as a marketer. It's something on TV. I had a slide where I put up Oprah. I was like, this is your competition. I mean, I know Oprah's now off the air, so I'm dating myself a bit. But that's who your competition is as a marketer, even for technology messages that we're taking to the marketplace. Because you have to really think about how people are consuming, because they are on 3 devices. They are doing 25 things at once. And how do you make it personalized across many different mediums with lots of different content, but still get that single mission across?
You brought up also accountability, and something that we had discussed around accountability. Digital has seemingly made things more measurable, but then we get into all these attribution challenges as well as marketers. So, how do we solve that to make sure that we're actually measuring the right outcomes? Kurt, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge with any of these new tools that we have is how do you actually integrate them and make them talk? I mean, most of us, how many people in the audience use Facebook by show of hands? Like pretty much everybody. Google, show of hands. As people are traveling across these different digital platforms, and those are probably 2 of the best measured platforms out there, it's the attribution challenge becomes pretty large. And so to Harsha's earlier point, I think increasingly I've had to become, and people on my team have had to become technologists to understand engineering and kind of the technology stack needed to track people across these different experiences. And increasingly these large platforms like Facebook and like Google are getting better and better at it. But I think at the end of the day, there's no substitute for what we've all been talking about, which is great storytelling, right? What really cuts through what people remember with clarity is the story, right? And so one of the challenges, A/B testing, I work for Coursera. We're a Silicon Valley-based platform for online learning. And we do a lot of A/B testing as a part of our product development. I'm sure all my peers here do that as well. And we constantly talk about the challenge between A/B testing is a great way to get optimization reads, but you also sometimes miss the larger movements. And so how do you string together a series of longitudinal tests that can actually give you that same feedback? And I think that's what we honestly all struggle with as marketers is the long-term kind of narrative that we're building around our brands versus the short-term driving of performance. And we see that even in our staff development, I think.
I will say on the attribution front, not afraid to admit failures. So when I got to Lever, there was me and one other marketer, and not long after that, we decided to purchase marketing attribution software. So we're marketing purely in a business-to-business context, and I'm sure the software was great, but I didn't have the technological expertise on the team, and so all it did was underscore the need for that operational skill set, mindset from a technology stack perspective to help us use that software. And we ended up cutting that spend just because we couldn't get the value out of it at that time in our sort of evolution.
That is ironic. You cut the spend for attributing ROI because you couldn't attribute the spend.
That's right.
But I think
Fantastic.
it comes back to
Wow.
how important, tech skills are.
Right.
I mean, if you look at like the MarTech, the big cloud of all the different technologies, I mean, I think we all as marketers who have a budget have spent on tech that we didn't use or couldn't use to its fullest ability. And so, we want the quick fix. Mm-hmm. We want the, hey, I'm going to go into the doctor and they're going to cut it off and it's going to be solved. And technology doesn't do that. You have to have people who understand that technology and can integrate it. And you have to, if you look at a lot of stats on marketing teams, my marketing team, a large percentage of the people are technologists. And I think I would challenge you, I'm going to get the stat wrong, but it's moving to 20 or 30% of marketing teams are now at a minimum technologists. And one of my favorite stories is a good friend of mine who's a very successful CMO of a tech startup, said she only took her job, she didn't negotiate vacation, she didn't negotiate pay, I hope she did, but she negotiated how many technology headcount she would get. She's like, I'm not going to take this CMO job unless I get at least 10 new headcount for tech. And I think that just speaks to your point, like you could buy this attribution software, but unless you can implement it in a way that's going to work for you, it doesn't matter.
I mean, ultimately though, you got to remember, you only measure what you can actually control and what you can actually change, right? I think oftentimes as marketers, and a lot of marketing tech makes this easy for you, you measure all kinds of things that are basically nonsense and that you can't control, that you can't actually influence. What is the point of measuring things you can't influence, right? Yeah. I won't be able to control the exact sequence in which I deliver impressions to an end user. That just doesn't happen, right? What is the point of me building an attribution model that actually does that for me, right? Mm-hmm. Don't build things, don't measure things that you don't really have a snowflake's chance of hell of controlling, right? Build things that you can actually control, that you can actually meaningfully change with your efforts as a marketer. That's one that we should all remember.
Let's talk a little bit about accountability. So we've discussed attribution to a degree. Digital, it's seemingly very measurable. Of course, we've got traditional marketing, which pre and post surveys and studies, brand effectiveness, there's methodology there. So how are each of you held accountable? So you've got teams, you're investing dollars in programs and people. How are you held accountable by your CEO, by your CFO? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So it varies across the team depending on which portion of marketing you're talking about. From a demand generation perspective, what's been interesting for me to observe over the evolution of Lever as an organization, when I first got there, everything was a lead. And the business just referred to leads, and which was quite amusing.
It's a dirty word, isn't it?
Yes. It is. And then we evolved to marketing qualified leads and thought we were doing better. But the lines were drawn in the sand. So once we had an MQL, we handed it over to our SDR team, and they either succeeded or they did not. And what we realized after a few months was that we just weren't seeing the conversion rates that we expected. And I think it's because as closely as our teams worked together, we didn't necessarily have a shared definition of what really constituted something that would move to an SQL. And so beginning of the year, we actually moved part of the SDR team into marketing. And now we are responsible for sales qualified leads. And the difference I have seen in terms of accountability, focus, clarity, teams working together seamlessly, I mean, it's night and day from last year.
That's fascinating.
What's the difference on revenue?
I'm not at liberty to say, but I will say that we did have our best quarter last quarter.
Good job.
So marketing should control sales outcomes. Is that what we're hearing?
You can take what you will from my statement.
So just a thought on this too. At Adobe, I was responsible for global demand generation, had a 150 marketing team, and spent 8 years doing that. And then 3 years later, I was responsible for the Americas inside sales team, about 220 people. So I was the recipient of all of the architecture, for good or for bad, of the lead generation. I wished I would have just been able to go back into marketing. So it's very interesting. I'd love to hear your experiences as well around accountability. How are you held accountable for your marketing investment, and how do you prove your value as a marketing organization these days? Kurt, Harsha?
Yeah, I would just say, I've been at Coursera 2.5 years. The company's 5 years old as a platform. We've got about 25 million users. It's shifted probably every 6 months, right? So we do use a system of OKRs, which is the way we run the company, and marketing has their set of OKRs. Broadly speaking, it's always some form of new user acquisition. There's a lot of both. I like to talk about output metrics and kind of operating metrics. So we hold the team accountable on a variety of different operating metrics that could be inputs to the output metrics. But generally, the output metrics are attached to revenue.
Can you give us some examples?
Well, like a good example would be, we're really focused on revenue, as I think most companies should be or could be. And one of the inputs is new first-time payers. So people that are new to the platform who pay for the first time would be an input metric to that. Brand awareness could be an upper funnel input metric to that as well. And so how do we actually put together the measurement plans for that? One of the things we've had to do as a team, and I think this is something that we're going to face more of in the future, is we're constantly iterating and testing different payment models. So we just moved from what we called a pay-as-you-go model to a subscription model. That basically reset all of our marketing metrics, right? Because now all of a sudden we're changing the way that our users interact with us and pay us. Everything had to be kind of start from scratch again, right? And go back to reestablishing baselines and understanding how that's impacted. And that's pretty much just par for the course now, right? So I think the point is that the measurement itself is always valuable, but I think the journey that you go through in developing and the questions that you ask around what should we be measuring, how should we be measuring it, and what, to Harsha's earlier point, what actionable decisions can I make off of that measurement?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's always been, new student acquisition and efficiency metrics, so cost per and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can get into the debate of whether it's marketing or sales or where it lies, but at the end of the day, as a system, as a new customer acquisition system across marketing and sales, you're both accountable for all of those. Neither can really work without the other. And so I think, for marketing teams to be successful, ultimately they have to be incented and held account to revenue and therefore efficiency.
Have any of you been able to accomplish the elusive ROI of marketing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to kind of add to your point and to get to the ROI question. And maybe I'm overstating marketing's role, but I fully 100% believe that marketing is the fuel that drives a company's success. And without a strong base of marketing, you're not going to succeed as a company. And so I think you have to sit back and say, what is the company trying to achieve? I don't want to be held accountable to top of the funnel pipeline. I mean, yeah, that's important. But if the company is trying to achieve revenue and do it within a cost-effective way, then hold me accountable to long-term value as a percentage of customer acquisition, LTV to CAC. If the company is really focused on retention, then hold me accountable to retention numbers. If the company is really focused on, you guys had some other metrics, on new logos, then so what is the company trying to achieve in the marketplace? And then give marketing those things to be accountable, because it changes as a marketer. If I'm held accountable for top of the funnel leads versus revenue at the bottom, I'm probably not going to spend money on pipeline acceleration to close deals. I'm not going to spend money on events that actually bring the revenue across the line because I'm hitting my goals at the top. So I actually believe marketing's goals should be the company's goals
Yeah.
if it's really going to be the fuel that drives the company.
That's a great call out. So ensure that it's not your own idea, but it's strategically aligned to the organizational objectives, and then you're measuring the leading and lagging indicators associatedly. Yeah, well said. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about, let's move on to the next topic. So with the changing landscape, let's talk about talent. And let's talk about the challenges associated with finding talent and the new skill sets that we need. A few of you were talking about the talent profile has changed organizationally, specifically within marketing. You're looking to hire, engineering, technical people. You're looking to hire more quantifiable, quant jocks and finance-oriented people. So let's hear about that. And I'm really curious to know, what's the right balance of skills? What's more important, creative or tech or quant? What do you all think? Or is that even the right question? Kurt?
I mean, I think it's all the above, right? And I think one without the other is very dangerous. But it does make it hard because as marketing's gotten more specialized in certain fields like performance marketing or internet marketing, they do tend to lend themselves with bench strength coming from a particular area, whether it be technical or quantitative. But ultimately, as you're trying to build out a robust marketing organization, you need capable leaders that understand the context of both the creative as well as the quantitative, as well as the technical. And that is part of the challenge. I talk about the full stack marketer. How do you actually develop that skill set? And so one of the things that I've always thought about when hiring junior marketers is how do we actually get them in a rotation so that, even if their strength is in creative development or visual design, how do we get them exposed to the quantitative area of the business? How do we get them exposed to the technical area of the business? Really, really important at an early point in their career.
That's great. Leela, you had mentioned something about tours of duty.
Yeah, so as a LinkedIn alum, I spent 4.5 years there. So I read The Alliance. I don't know how many of you have read Hoffman's book, The Alliance? Any takers? No, my goodness. Well, let me tell you should read this book. It's a fantastic look at how the contract between the employer and the employee is changing. I think it ties in very neatly with a lot of the discussion that's been happening all day in the rooms around future of work. And what are an employee's expectations from work today? And Reed's thesis revolves around this idea of putting your most talented employees on a tour of duty. Each tour of duty is probably, depending on your environment, between 18 to 24 months. And the thesis is that within that time frame, which is now an eternity for millennials, let's face it, if they're not looking for their next career within your organization, you can be pretty sure somebody else externally is tapping them on the shoulder and helping them understand how their career can be furthered in a different organization. And so I think at LinkedIn we were very good at this, back when I was there. And the next tour of duty might look like a lateral move into a different team. It might look like a geographic transfer to the other side of the world. It might be something completely different. But in order to have that be the way that talent learns, grows, and develops in your organization, you have to open up the lines of communication and make sure that your employees know that those are options and that this is something that you're willing to explore with them. And in fact, even at Lever today, the first marketer who joined our team is now exactly 2 years in, and we're moving her from content marketing to product marketing because she's very eager to grow her skill set.
That's great. Interesting. What about turf wars? So you're talking about hiring technology people. Why aren't they in IT? Why aren't they under the office of the CIO? What kind of friction does that create internally? Any thoughts, Harsha?
Yeah, I mean, I think, thankfully, James was here till a second, and if we get into a wrestling match, he'll probably squish me like a bug, so I don't want to get into that with him. But,
Shouldn't have asked that question, sorry.
Thankfully, the skill sets required for being a sort of, we're living in a world of such specialization, and the skill sets required for, you to be a full stack programmer versus somebody who does web production or somebody who does sort of data science, data analytics, fairly different and fairly differentiated in terms of where those are. Now, that said, the tour of duty concept probably expands across these orgs as well, right? I want my analysts to understand what is going on, in terms of the latest and best on the technology side and understand that roadmap and bring some of those disciplines back into marketing.
Yeah.
So that notion of tour of duties probably works across tech and marketing as well.
Yeah.
Ultimately, these two teams increasingly, and that's part of the new challenge for the marketer, the tech team and the marketing team have to work really closely together. It doesn't work if they don't. And so to that extent, if there's some osmosis between the two teams, that's actually great. Like, we'd probably encourage that. Right?
That's great advice. Just the osmosis, the co-collaboration. I remember I've lost some really great talent because they were tired of having to feel like they were getting sucked into the technical side of Adobe. I had a really talented engineering leader in marketing, built out marketing applications, integrations, and the IT organization kept saying, we want him in IT. And he kept saying, I'm not a technologist, I'm a marketing technologist, leave me alone. And after 3 years of turf wars, he ended up leaving, and I lost a really talented individual. Hopefully that is becoming not a problem as more and more technology needs are becoming infused in marketing. But have you seen these problems inside of your own organizations? Not a problem yet.
I think we would always rather retain somebody incredible in some capacity in the organization than get into a turf war. So short answer, no.
Oh.
And I think as your company scales, and you know, if you're, for example, if you're public, having worked at large companies like SAP and Oracle and startups, like my prior company, you know, as you scale and get to that level and some of the legal requirements and restrictions that come in place on your IT infrastructure, I think you have to move a bit to a hub and spoke. So you might have some of the core maintenance and uptime and other things managed by an IT team, but your true brain of how you use those products and what you get out of those products has to be within the business.
Yeah, great advice.
I would just echo, I'm a big fan of embedded models, so where you have direct kind of functional line of reporting, and then you create kind of these virtual teams. I mean, I think Hollywood is a good analogy for this. When, you know, movies are big feature films. I came from the Walt Disney Company. And same thing with games and entertainment. You bring kind of spontaneously a group of resources together to work on a project, and then kind of they disband and come back together and so forth. And so as an example, both at eBay, where I worked prior to Disney, and then even at Coursera, there's always been some element of embedding when it comes to both technology, and analytics is usually the other area where I've seen that pretty commonplace.
So how are you finding this talent? And where are you looking these days? And what are you looking for in these talents? We're talking about technologists, we're talking about quant jocks, we're talking about creatives. How are you finding these individuals, and what are the challenges associated with finding them? Harsha?
Everywhere. I'm probably roaming the hallways here looking for them. You know, these are, particularly if you're a, growing organization, fast-growing organization, keeping up with the pace at which you need, particularly the more technical skill sets, is incredibly hard. And therefore, you have to develop multiple different pipelines, right? You need to have the fresh out of college, I'll hire a bunch of smart kids and teach them how to do this and build a pipeline that way. You need to have that. You need to find those with a little bit of experience that, that can come hit the ground running and maybe manage teams. You need to find and, of course, cultivate sort of the right leadership levels. You need to have multiple pipelines, and you can't ignore the fact that you will have to invest in a fair number of people who might come with an adjacent skill set but not the exact skill set you need. And you're going to have to train them and get them there. And guess what? That's probably becoming a lifelong endeavor, because in 3 years, whatever you taught them is probably obsolete anyways. And you have to teach them all over again, which means you have to build that infrastructure to keep doing that over and over again anyways. So you look for them everywhere, and you segment it and figure out how to build multiple pipelines that you can address at various stages of maturity.
That's great.
I think his point is, you just said something brilliant. It's not just about going out and hiring the people that have the technology talent you need, it's growing the people in-house. So even if you hired the absolute best marketing technologists on the planet, their skills are obsolete in 2 years. So unless you're investing in them, unless you're training them, unless you're getting them up on the next latest and greatest technology talent, fire them in 2 years and start over again. And we all know how hard it is, customer acquisition cost and customer retention. It's the same thing with talent. So I think the answer isn't just where are you looking to hire people, it's how are you investing to train the people you have.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Just one thing that we've actually done some research on this at Lever. So we look across the companies that we work with, 1,300 or so today, and look at the patterns. I mean, where are great candidates coming from? Where are these hires coming from? And our data shows that as far as job applicants, so people who actually come to either your career site or a job board, only 1 in 152 of those is hired. In marketing, it's 1 in 192. Which I think speaks to the fact that we've seen this, diversification of skills, and in marketing there are so many different disciplines and capabilities within the marketing function today that it's becoming harder and harder to find the one unless you start to think about how can you take a skill set that's almost there and train it. But the other, from this research, 1 in 72 sourced candidates is hired, so people that you actually go out and proactively approach. They may not be looking for a role, but their skill set looks terrific for your business. And then 1 in 16 employee referrals is hired. So if you are not tapping your internal employees, your investor network, other partners, for example, have been a great source of referral for us, then you're probably missing a trick.
So with these stats, this is good information, good insight for all of us to be aware of. As we think about where we're finding people, as well as how we're developing people internally, I know that, for example, Heather at Pluralsight, your company focuses in this and helping to keep the skills fresh and on the cutting edge. How do learners take this information, and what's the best way for us to make sure that they're learning this, and what's the best way to present this to them? How do we give this to them?
It's interesting. I've been learning a lot working at a learning platform, but people learn in different ways, and everyone's different, and so you need to give them different options. So at Pluralsight, we have learn by watching, learn by doing project-based work, video chats with mentoring when you really need to engage with somebody and, for example, have them look at the code that you're trying to code in because you're learning JavaScript. So people learn in bite-sized, little small amounts of content. People learn by searching for exactly what they want and then hitting it there. Some people learn in long form. So you really have to serve up to people a way that they can incorporate and they can learn on their schedule. And you have to do it in a cost-effective way.
That's great, thank you. So I think this brings us to our third topic around innovations in technology and what this means for learning, both inside of our environments as well as outside of our organizations. So, how are the technology offerings changing the landscape by which we ensure that our teams are learning? And how do we take advantage of that? Kurt, any insights there?
I think it's an incredible time right now. When I think about one of the things that attracted me into the education and ed tech space was having seen what technology has done to places like retail, and you think about what it's done in places like payments and other industries. There's really probably 2 industries, healthcare and education, where we haven't seen necessarily that big impact yet. And I think it's on the horizon. And so one of the things is just the content distribution. At Coursera, 70% of our learners are from outside the US. And that was from the get-go when the platform launched back in 2012. That was a pretty incredible stat to me because I had come from big platforms like eBay and the Walt Disney Company, and you would take years to build up an international reach like that, and it happened overnight. And I think what you're seeing is in many of these markets like India and Brazil and so forth, where there's huge demographic explosions of youth that need education and access to high quality education, the reality is they're skipping the landlines, as I like to say. They're not building landline telephony. They went straight to mobile, right, and cellular technology. And I think the same thing is happening in education, and it's an exciting time. And we have, for example, 60% of our learners in Coursera that are in China are learning on mobile. That's their primary device. In the US, it tends to be more of a companion type of learning device. But a lot of people spend time commuting in China, right, on subways and trains. And so we had to make our videos downloadable so that people could view them offline and things like that. So I think it's really thinking about how do you take the great content that you have and reimagine how you distribute that content and provide access, and generally just open it up using technology.
The one thing to add, though, great that there's so much more access to content for people to learn from, but the importance of hands-on learning, the importance of actually being in the environment and actually learning, whether it's whether you want to become a nurse or a great search marketer, right? How do you replace, real data, hands-on experience, having to make real judgment calls and decisions based on where you are. I think we shouldn't forget that, a majority of learning actually happens from actually doing it. So as much content as you can set up for your people to consume, if you don't give them the time and space and resources almost to experiment their way to learning what is new, I'm talking about in the marketing context in particular, I don't think you get where you need to get to. So again, as marketers, I think that's one of the things we need to remember is make sure you're setting up an environment for your people to not just learn a conceptual skill somewhere off of a platform, but come back and apply that and give them the latitude to experiment their way to learning much more about it.
That rings really true. I just a thought on that, just a stat internally at Adobe. So we hired a group of 15, 20 inside salespeople, and they got a really great hands-on learning experience. It's a sales academy. And we paired them with mentors over the course of 6 months. And then we tried to scale it. And scale internally meant on-demand training. And we didn't have enough mentors for all those people the next year. And we tried to hire 35 the next year. And we saw the performance metrics in the first 6 months. It took a nosedive. And so what you're saying, Harsha, here is this modality of learning, we have to make sure that it's right, and having the hands-on mentors versus the on-demand, how do we strike that right balance? So Heather, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I don't think it's an either or. So, if you look at the product that Pluralsight delivers, we do have, courseware, that's videos, the kind of concepts you're talking about. We also have project-based learning. So you get a coding assignment. You have to go in and do an actual hands-on coding. And then we have mentoring that's video chats that you can share your screen when you get stuck, and the mentor will come on and help you. So I think we need to think out of the box, kind of back to Coursera having so many people outside of the US. I love this quote that, I think it was Gandhi, but if it's not, I'm going to give him credit because he said so many wonderful things, that brilliance is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. And there are people around the globe who could massively change their lifestyle and their communities and their entire marketplaces with education and with learning. And they're not going to have the ability to get on a plane and fly to an in-person training session. But they can log on to their phone on the commuter train and pick the way they want to learn and massively change their family's livelihood and change their community. And so I think we need to use technology to solve some of these challenges.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, I remember I went to business school in the late 90s, and I remember we were doing a case on eBay, my eventual employer, and we were debating, would people actually buy something from a stranger, sight unseen, and ship it in the mail and pay them without seeing it? And it's something, you laugh, but it's something we take for granted now, right? That you'll buy off of a small website on Google because you're like, oh, I can always charge it back to my credit card and so forth. And so I agree with Harsha's point that there's no substitute for that kind of one-on-one in-person learning. But that's only accessible to a very, very small percentage of the world's population, and only ever will be, just by the nature of the scaling issues that you talked about. I think what we're on the future of, if you will, is looking at ways that we can actually use technology to overcome some of these barriers, right? Project-based learning is a great example of that, which is, at Coursera, we've been working with a lot of our university partners to get out of the conceptual realm into really thinking about how do you combine capstone projects and actual projects, even working with industry partners. We had a session earlier this morning, work with IBM and Google and some other companies. How do you bring together the best of university education with the best of industry to help people work on those skills that they need that are so valuable and in demand in the labor market? Yeah,
and then on the topic of technology helping to find the equally distributed brilliance. Andelo spoke earlier this morning. I don't know if anyone caught that session. And what they're doing is truly remarkable. They're basically scouring certain nations in Africa to find the top 1-2% of talent, and then providing them with the training so that they can basically be a virtual workforce for some of Silicon Valley's largest and most admired companies.
Yeah, they're training through Pluralsight.
And we see this all the time. I mean, we have some amazing learner stories that just come to us organically. And one of the things that's really, really inspiring and uplifting to all of us as employees at Coursera is a lot of these people are finding their own self-confidence, right? So they didn't know that they had the ability to complete an algorithms course by a Stanford professor, right? But they found it online, they did it in their extra time, and it's just kind of boosted them up to that next level, to the willingness and desire to kind of try something new.
That's fascinating. One of the things that comes to mind is just looking at children these days, younger children, and the same type of educational quality of content exists for them as it does for those of us who are in the workforce. I think of my 10-year-old again. He said, "Dad, I want to learn how to JavaScript." And I was like, "What? You want to learn how to code JavaScript?" So I found him a book, and he's like, "I don't need a book. I'm going to go to YouTube, and I'm going to learn how to do JavaScript." And I thought, okay, this is fascinating. So this flattening of the world concept with education is something that's upon us now. I'm curious also, in our own work environments, we've talked about some of these, they can be scary if they're new to us, around we need to hire people with technology skills, quant skills, other skill sets. How do we create the right environment of learning in our own organizations? How much is prescriptive versus how much do we say, go out and learn on your own? How do we create that environment? I'm curious to know. Harsha?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of all the other, whether we talked about all the technical skills and all of that people need to learn, today's workforce also needs to learn a lot of people skills, right? If you put the technologist and the videographer and the content strategist and all of these various people personalities together, they also need to figure out how to coexist and bring out the best product. So, a lot of the skills that they need to develop are also those people skills.
Is there an on-demand course for that?
The soft skills.
These folks should know. But I think the one advantage I think we have is, particularly with the millennial workforce being digital, being oriented around discovery themselves, like you said, my 2-year-old is more of an expert on YouTube than I am, in terms of sort of finding what he wants out of it. I think, we shouldn't have that much of a concern with them discovering learning, once you give them the options, once you set them up with an environment where you're encouraging that kind of learning. And, just the history of the last 10 plus years in our economy should teach everyone that, these skills are always fluid. You're always looking to develop the next skill and the next skill and the next skill. So, I think as long as we as managers, as leaders, create the space for people, I actually have a lot of faith that we're growing up in a generation at a time where people are able to discover and find learning for themselves. You just need to make sure they have the space for it.
Leela?
Yeah, I agree on that. Although I have started embedding the very conscious question into performance reviews of what would you like to learn in the next 6 months. So I think most, to your point, Harsha, most of the sort of millennial generation is actively looking for ways to improve skills and grow. But for those who aren't, I think just opening up the dialogue around it can help.
How do you help your teams feel safe and that you expect them to learn and set aside time for that? Is that something you're consciously thinking about? Tell us about that. Heather?
One thing that I've done is set aside a budget for every person and be like, hey, we're going to set aside a certain amount of budget this year, and each person gets that. And you have to come, and when you do your OKRs, your MBOs for the year, you have to also come up with one that's your training schedule. And we work on it together. So, I might have a millennial who comes in who thinks they're great at this and they want to train on that. And we do some of that, but I also and ABC is an area where you could use a little bit of help too. So why don't we collectively figure out a training plan for you that helps in both areas? And then, we have a set budget, and you're expected to invest in yourself. Invest in yourself. And I think most people take it seriously, and they love that the company's investing in them.
Hopefully this isn't too nosy. What kind of budgets are you setting aside for employees?
Well, I don't think I'm going to share that.
Okay.
But it could be, I think it definitely needs to be in the thousands of dollars.
Okay, good.
So, if you want to go to one, and that could be everything from like, hey, I actually had a couple people attend the Adobe Summit this year as part of their training budget, and you can share with people how much that costs. So
$1,200.
So there you go. So, and that used up most of their, no, but yeah. So you get one summit, and there might be some online, but yeah, I think it needs to be significant.
That's great.
It needs to be a significant time budget in terms of time as well, right? Making sure you're giving people, enough that, they still have, 5-10% of their bandwidth that they can actually invest towards trying that new thing. And by the way, if you set this up the right way, guess what? They'll learn something that they'll come and apply back to what they're doing day in, day out for you.
I heard some big numbers there, 5 to 10% of time. That's
time, right?
That's great.
And as long as you create the incentives for them to go find on our teams, for example, we talk about, hey, go find that next sort of media channel, right? Go find that next medium, for example. And I'm happy for you to spend some time going experimenting to go get that. And so much of it is of course the budget towards coursework and those kinds of things, but it's the time budget in their lives for them to go spend on trying something new and learning out of it as well.
So I have a startup budget. So the way I scale learning is there's kind of a soft condition on the attending conferences and things that you must come back and share with the team what you've learned, so that hopefully we all continue to grow.
Good
And
idea.
one other thing I'll throw on that is, I don't know if it works yet, so ask me in a couple months, but one of my managers has implemented a no meeting Wednesdays. So no one on that team takes meetings on Wednesdays, which truthfully, they occasionally will make an exception for me, but even me, they're like, yeah, it's no meeting Wednesday. And they spend
We do that at Coursera
Yeah.
for the whole company.
And they spend a part of that time, is it Wednesday?
Yeah, it's Wednesday.
That's awesome. I'm
It's
thinking,
intended to be a maker day.
all right, then I'm calling you on a Wednesday.
Can we make that a global thing?
do that.
And
No
they
meeting
spend-
Wednesdays?
And they spend part of their no meeting Wednesdays on training. So that would be your time that you can do that. You can find the next channel, you can, other things.
Fantastic.
Yep.
So we have had, we've covered a variety of topics here. We've talked about, digital and the changing landscape and accountability and marketing, what that means for us as marketers, from singular value propositions and not losing control of the fundamentals of marketing. We've talked about the challenges of acquiring talent, finding talent, keeping them up to date, and making sure they're well trained. And then we've also discussed innovations and how this has made it more challenging for us, but also it's flattened the world and the access to education and technology again.